Good day. Several people have been commenting on the threads of my various recent videos. There's been a curious shift over the last few weeks and months in the focus of concern in the world of international relations. Back in the summer and early autumn, the major focus was on Taiwan, on the conflict between China and the United States over Taiwan, on Chinese military steps with respect to Taiwan, the fact that the Chinese Air Force seemed to be probing Taiwan's air defenses, and upon the fact that the Chinese were making it very clear that any move by Taiwan towards declaring independence from China was, as far as China was concerned, a red line, and that China would respond forcefully if that red line was crossed, in a way that made it fairly clear that China was entertaining at least the option of military action to prevent that outcome. So that was the major focus of concern. I did several programs about it for this channel. There was much discussion of the issue of Taiwan in Global Times, the semi-official newspaper published in English, published in part in English, which the Chinese government uses to articulate its thoughts and policies, comments, editorials, which I discussed there. And of course, we had very ambiguous statements from the United States about the issue of Taiwan as well, with the United States at one and the same time appearing to support the push or the moves towards independence that Taiwan, the present authorities in Taiwan, was taking, whilst simultaneously telling the Chinese that it continued to support the One China policy, a policy which in effect recognizes that there is only one China, of which Taiwan is part, and that the government of that single united China is the government in Beijing, and that the United States will not stand in the way of the eventual process of peaceful reunification of Taiwan Island with mainland China. So the United States appeared to be saying one thing to the Chinese. It appeared to be doing something rather different with respect to Taiwan, in contrast to what it was telling the Chinese. Well, that was the big story a few weeks and months ago. And then at some point in the late autumn, Ukraine suddenly became the story. It became the story with all sorts of flesh-creeping talk about vast concentrations of Russian troops around Ukraine's borders. And unquestionably, there have been concentrations and build-up of Russian reserves and logistical preparations in areas which have some proximity to Ukraine, but certainly the stories about a Russian military build-up on Ukraine's borders were not just exaggerated, but frankly untrue. But piggybacking on all of that, the Russians then launched their démarche. They started to make demands that the eastward expansion of NATO should stop. They made it clear that this was a red line. They made it clear that they reserved the right to take forceful action to prevent it. And now they are insisting that there should be legally binding guarantees, as they call it, that eastward expansion of NATO should end, that the United States and NATO should withdraw their promise to Ukraine and Georgia that those two countries will one day become members of NATO. And the Russians are making even more demands. They're demanding that the entire military infrastructure that the United States and NATO has created in the countries of the former Warsaw Pact, which became parts of NATO after 1997, that entire military infrastructure be comprehensively dismantled in a way which would de facto reverse the whole process of NATO eastward expansion which we have seen since 1997. And these Russian demands have increased tensions to extraordinary levels, and the United States, rather grudgingly, rather unwillingly, has been forced to the negotiating table with all sorts of talks in January between the Russians and the Americans to discuss these Russian, not proposals, they're not proposals, but rather demands. So that consequence, that crisis in Europe, if you like, seems to have put the question of Taiwan somewhat in the shadows. However, the reality is that the crisis over Taiwan has not gone away. On the contrary, certain further moves or steps have been taken which suggest that this slow burning fuse is inching ever so slowly, ever so certainly towards the inevitable explosion, which is probably now only a few years away. And I refer in particular to testimony given in a Senate hearing by U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs, Eli Ratner. Now, this particular testimony, which Eli Ratner gave to the Senate, has now been the topic of a long article, an interesting article, in the Financial Times. Now, I'm not going to read out the whole article because it is behind a paywall, but I'm going to make a few quick points by way of reminder, which is that the Financial Times has increasingly become the sounding board that various officials within the US administration appear to use in order to communicate, probably primarily to European audiences, US policies and US concerns. By way of illustration, it was in the Financial Times that we first learnt, by way of an article in the Financial Times, that we first learnt the news about the Chinese hypersonic glide vehicle test a few weeks ago. And it has been in the Financial Times that we have also learnt about some of the US positions and policies with respect to the conflict in Ukraine. So when the Financial Times gives particular weight to the comments of someone like Eli Ratner at a Senate hearing, I take that as a clear sign that the administration itself, or at least some people within the administration, hardliners if you like, within the administration, want to publicise Eli Ratner's comments at the Senate hearing and to articulate them and to make them widely known in Europe and by extension the world. Now, as I said, because it is behind a paywall, I'm not going to read the entire Financial Times article, but I'm going to read what I consider to be the most salient points. And its title is US Shows China Its Hand on Strategic Value of Unsinkable Taiwan. The article is by a journalist called Catherine Hiller, and it goes on to say Washington's clear statement of Ireland's regional security role, part of tougher stance towards Beijing. And then the article starts as follows. In June 1950, General Douglas MacArthur, the commander of US forces in Asia Pacific, urged President Harry Truman in a top-secret memorandum not to allow China to gain control of Taiwan. Its location at the center of an island chain off the Chinese coast, which would have strategic value in a conflict, meant that the island, more commonly known as Formosa at that time, could be compared to an unsinkable aircraft carrier, MacArthur wrote. He warned that the strategic interests of the United States will be in serious jeopardy if Formosa is allowed to be dominated by a hostile power. Then, importantly, the article provides a link to General MacArthur's original 1950 memorandum. And I also provide at the bottom of this video a link to that memorandum. And it says all kinds of things. MacArthur's memorandum says all sorts of things, and it talks about a paragraph 4, as a result of its geographical location and base potential, utilization of Formosa by a military power hostile to the United States may either counterbalance or overshadow the strategic importance of the central and southern flank of the United States frontline position. Formosa in the hands of the communists can be compared to an unsinkable aircraft carrier and submarine tender, ideally located to accomplish Soviet offensive strategy and at the same time checkmate counteroffensive operations by United States forces based in Okinawa and the Philippines. The unsinkable carrier tender has the capacity to operate from 10 to 20 air groups of types ranging from jet fighters to strategic bombers, as well as to provide forward operating facilities for the short-range coastal submarines, which are predominant in the Russian Asiatic Navy. If Formosa should be acquired by the Chinese Communists and bases thereon made available to the USSR, Russia will have acquired an additional fleet which will have been obtained and can be maintained at an incomparably lower cost to the Soviets than could its equivalent or 10 or 20 aircraft carriers with its supporting forces. Now, of course, this is a memorandum written in 1950. It's the Soviet Union which is the major threat at this time, but it's not difficult to see how you could replace the Soviet Union with China and many of the same things that Douglas MacArthur was talking about in 1950, which were attributed to the Soviet Union. Well, they could perhaps with some stretch be attributed to China today. Taiwan, in the hands of the Chinese, would supposedly become an unsinkable aircraft carrier threatening the US position in the entire Indo-Pacific region. And then you go on to see some of the same ideological observations as are being made today, cited again in support of, cited back in 1950 in support of Taiwanese independence. So again, this is from MacArthur's 1950 memorandum. Historically, Formosa has been used as a springhead for aggressive, as a springboard for military aggression directed against areas to the south. And then he talks about how the Japanese used Formosa in that way. And then MacArthur goes on to say at paragraph 8, Formosa represents a political theatre of no less importance to Western ideology than other areas in the Orient. The Taiwanese are a homogeneous racial group, this is the language of 1950, who as individuals have resisted the intrusion of foreign blood. Well, as I said, that's the world of 1950. They didn't have quite the same attitudes in the United States then as they do today. To continue, although Formosa was promised to China as a consequence of World War II, this promise was given in consonance with a political situation entirely different than that which now exists, there is every basis from a moral standpoint to offer to the Taiwanese an opportunity to develop their own political future in an atmosphere unfettered by the dictates of a communist police state. In view of the moral implications, as well as the geographic proximity of this area to other endangered peoples on and near the periphery of China, the future status of Formosa can well be an important factor in determining the political alignment of those national groups who have or must soon make a choice between communism and the West. So the language is completely different. In fact, it's unacceptably different from the language of today, but actually, in reality, the substance is exactly the same. Just as today, we talk about supporting Taiwan because it's, we have this ideological alignment with democratic Taiwan, and doing so is consistent with our values. So back in 1950, MacArthur, using quite different language, was also saying that supporting Taiwan is not only a strategic imperative, it is also a moral obligation, and it is also consistent with our values. And just as today, people like Blinken and Sullivan and other people in the United States talking about support for Taiwan being essential in order to project strength and to inspire confidence in the United States amongst the other nations and states of Asia, MacArthur in 1950 was saying essentially the same thing. So, as the French like to say, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. In other words, what was being said in 1950 is not so very different. In fact, in essence, it is identical to what is being said today. However, what I find really very interesting is that this old memorandum of MacArthur's from 1950 has been unearthed and rediscovered, and is now being a link is being provided to it in a Financial Times article. And I wonder whether that is just chance. I can't help but think that, on the contrary, it is fully intentional, and that whoever has briefed the Financial Times about the testimony given by Mr. Ratner to the Senate was wanting to make sure that this old memorandum by General MacArthur from 1950, that was also brought back to general notice and attention. Anyway, to go back to the Financial Times article, some 7 decades later, echoes of MacArthur's language are reverberating through US-China relations. Eli Ratner, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs, told a Senate hearing 3 weeks ago that Taiwan was critical to the region's security and critical to the defense of vital US interests. In words strikingly similar to MacArthur's, he emphasized the island's location at a critical node within the first island chain, anchoring a network of US allies and partners. And then the article goes on to read, this may well be remembered as the moment Washington came clean on its intentions regarding Taiwan. In Beijing, at least, the statement is being read as dropping all pretense that the US could acquiesce to a unification of Taiwan with China. And then the article then goes on to quote Wu Xinbo, who is director of the Center for American Studies at Fudan University in China, saying that in his opinion, the perspectives US policy with respect to Taiwan has always been the same as it was in MacArthur's day. The US has never really wanted or accepted the possibility of Taiwan ever reuniting with China, because Taiwan is too important to the US strategic position in the Indo-Pacific region ever to be given up. And then the Financial Times quotes Mr. Wu Xinbo saying, when we ask the US if they do not hope to see the unification of China, they deny that, but judging from the US's concrete actions, it is clear that they indeed do not hope to see China unify. Eli Ratner has said this out loud. And then there is a long discussion about whether, in fact, this policy of trying to prevent Taiwan reunifying with China does, in fact, contradict the letter of the US's One China policy. Well, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but it certainly contradicts the spirit, and it will certainly be seen as a contradiction of that policy in Beijing. But then we finish with another quotation from Bonnie Lin, who is the director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. And she says, in the last Taiwan Strait crisis in the mid-1990s, China's Air Force barely even had the capability to fly past the Taiwan Strait center line, but the People's Liberation Army has gained enormous capabilities over the past 20 years. If China had Taiwan now, it would give China extra power projection capabilities that would also have an immense impact on the security of US allies, including Japan and the Philippines. And somebody else, a gentleman called Vincent Chow, who is a former head of the political section at Taiwan's representative office in Washington, is then quoted by the Financial Times as saying, "Is Ratner's statement a departure from the past? Yes, it is from what we had 5 or 10 years ago, but not from what we have seen more recently. There is greater recognition of the threat Taiwan faces, and also a shift in regional attitudes towards Taiwan and China." And those are the words of a Taiwanese diplomat, or a retired Taiwanese diplomat. And by the way, just to finish this summary, the article has of course also been picked up, not just in China, the Financial Times article, not just in China, it's also been picked up in Taiwan itself. There's an article in Taiwan Times by someone called Liam Gibson, and it's entitled, "US once again thinks Taiwan is unsinkable aircraft carrier." Financial Times says US channels former General MacArthur's old metaphor in latest statement. And then the article goes on to say, and it's datelined Taipei, Taiwan News, presumably Taiwan's news agency, "Washington's return to its historic policy of ensuring Taiwan's security so as to wield geopolitical advantage over Beijing is explored in a Financial Times article. Veteran correspondent Catherine Hill has penned the piece and quoted former US General MacArthur, who described Formosa, which is to say Taiwan, in 1950 as an unsinkable aircraft carrier that should not be allowed to be dominated by a hostile power. She then compared this to Eli Ratner, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs, who recently said Taiwan is vital to the defense of vital US interests, etc. So there we go. It's been picked up in Taiwan, it's been picked up in Beijing, and the Financial Times is in effect telling us that it represents a major shift in US policy. And as I said previously, all the past indications are, over the last few months, that the Financial Times is extremely closely attuned to US thinking on geostrategic and foreign policy questions. So where does all this leave us? Well, it's now, I think, straightforward, clear. In fact, it's been obvious to me for a while that the United States no longer supports the one China policy. It may pretend to the Chinese that it does, but in reality and to all intents and purposes, it does not. Its policy is not, I think, so much to try to use Taiwan as an unsinkable aircraft carrier carrying the US Air Force in order to intimidate and threaten China. It is rather to prevent China gaining control of Taiwan, which it instead sees as, which would be in that case, an unsinkable aircraft carrier to be utilized by China as it projects naval and military power across the entire Indo-Pacific region. Whether Taiwan really does have this enormous geostrategic importance that all these articles suggest, I'm far from sure. Whether it makes any sense, actually, to use the kind of strategic thinking that might have been valid in the 1950s with the very, very different types of military technology which existed in those days to the world of today, well, that's another matter again. To be straightforward about it, am deeply skeptical. But it's quite clear that so far as the Pentagon is concerned, at least so far as the naval and air force elements that make up the Pentagon, those parts of the US military defense bureaucracy are concerned, it is now clearly a priority to prevent Taiwan's reunification with China and to deny China use of Taiwan as a forward base, as, if you like, an unsinkable aircraft carrier which the Chinese can then use, and submarine tender that the Chinese can then use, supposedly, to dominate the Pacific. Now, that straightforwardly puts the United States, if it's going to stick with this policy, in a collision course with China. Now, the Chinese have made it absolutely clear that sooner or later they do expect and want to see Taiwan reunified with China. As far as the Chinese are concerned, that is part of the historic mission that the Chinese Communist Party inherited, and it's part of the Chinese Communist Party's contract with the Chinese people that they will end the century of humiliation that China suffered before the Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1949 and complete all the unfinished business from that time, including the unresolved issue of Taiwan. Given that this is so, given that this is a priority for the Chinese, given that this is the clear intention of the Chinese, it is very difficult to see how the Chinese can accept a situation where the United States is, in effect, assisting the authorities in Taiwan to edge steadily towards some kind of independence. I suspect that US policy is not to support an outright declaration of independence by Taiwan from China. I think the United States recognizes that that would cross a Chinese red line and would precipitate a war in the Indo-Pacific region, which the United States cannot win. I think what the United States wants is a situation where Taiwan, in effect, reconstitutes itself as a de facto ally of the United States, operates as a de facto independent country, does everything that makes it in form and in fact an independent country and a military ally of the United States, but just stops short of that one thing of declaring its independence and of formally entering into a treaty with a treaty of defense with the United States. And the result is all the various steps we are seeing. The Taiwan offices around the world being converted gradually, at least in US allies and presumably at some point in Washington too, into Taiwan representative offices, in effect embassies, and we start to see all those sort of things happening, all those other steps being taken, the attempts also to get Taiwan involved in the United Nations, at least in some of the agencies and bodies of the United Nations, as if it was in fact an independent country. Now, the Chinese, of course, are well aware of all of this, and I'm going to say straightforwardly that I think that the United States is playing here an extremely dangerous game, because, of course, the Chinese understand exactly what the United States is doing, and I think that what we're now starting to see is China reorienting itself, reorganizing its economy, rebuilding up its alliance system, and focusing on its military build-up with a view to eventually resolving the crisis in Taiwan militarily, if it has to, and at the same time creating that degree of resilience for the Chinese economy, so that if the United States then retaliates with the sort of across-the-board sanctions that have been talked about, a blockade, if you like, of the Straits of Malacca to prevent oil and food from reaching China, when that happens, then China will be in a position to withstand all of that, because it will be in a position, it will have reorganized its economy and its society and its treaty systems in order to be able to absorb that kind of blow. And here, of course, we start to understand some of the things that are happening within China itself. It begins to make sense, therefore, why the Chinese have pricked their property bubble. They don't want to have a situation where there are potential financial vulnerabilities within China that could weaken its economy. They also are taking steps to tighten control of their information space, which is what we see with the various crackdowns on some of the Chinese big tech companies. Above all, we're seeing a major effort by the Chinese to start to shift the pattern of their economy away from export of finished goods towards internal consumption. And we are also seeing, and perhaps this is the most important part of the equation of all, China forging this strategic partnership for a new era with Russia, building gas pipelines and oil pipelines with Russia, or entering into agreements with Russia for those kind of pipelines to be built, investing increasingly in the Russian agricultural system, exploring with the Russians various scientific and technological projects. Apparently, there's now also a project to develop rare earths in Russia as well, to see whether Russia can be part of that too. So that, of course, will provide China with a massive natural resource hinterland at its back, making it, in effect, a self-sufficient entity, no longer dependent on oil supplies from passing through the Malacca Straits, no longer dependent on imports of food passing through the Malacca Straits as well. And of course, it's not just Russia, it's also forging similar links with Iran, with Pakistan to access Iranian oil and natural gas, and to build direct routes, overland pipelines and ports and such things to the Gulf, to countries like Saudi Arabia, with which China is also forging ever closer relations, again in order to get round to circumvent those choke points that the United States conceivably could control, like the Malacca Straits. And of course, the other big story here is of this major build-up by the Chinese military. The test of the hypersonic glide vehicle, I've no doubt that that actually happened. The enhancement of China's strategic deterrent force, I've no doubt that that has happened also. And of course, the rapid build-up of the Chinese Navy and Air Force, which I've discussed in previous programs, the Chinese aircraft carrier building program, the Chinese nuclear submarine building program, the likelihood that China is now heavily involved, probably with Russia, in hypersonic missile technology. All of those things in order to make China militarily strong, overwhelmingly strong in the area of the Taiwan Straits, and in a position where it can withstand a blockade if that is what the United States, in response to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, if that situation were ever to arise. There's been much talk on the threads of these programs about who benefits most and who depends most in terms of the Russia-China partnership. Is Russia becoming overly dependent on China? Well, actually, if you look at this from a geostrategic point of view, you can see why, though Russia does indeed rely increasingly on the support of China in facing off against the West in Europe, China needs Russia just as much. And again, there have also been all kinds of comments on threads to these articles about the changes within the Chinese economy, the Evergrande affair, those sort of things. And again, I think that people to some extent misunderstand the reasoning behind these things. I think that these are products. The Evergrande affair is a product of changing Chinese economic priorities. Instead of allowing massively inflated property bubbles to keep the GDP figures, goose up the GDP figures and things like that, the Chinese, instead of wanting to allow that sort of thing to happen, are not aiming any longer for 6, 8, 10% growth a year and for vast exports to the United States. They're aiming for something different, economic resiliency and organic growth within China itself, which would again make, as I said, as part of this policy of making China, in effect, more resilient to pressure from the United States. And I have to say that I think if one looks at Chinese programs and Russian programs, which are obviously increasingly harmonized, again, a point which perhaps requires much more exploration, one can see that the real strategic crisis is not going to come this winter, as many people seem to think. It's going to come in a couple of years' time, around 2024, 2025, when both the Chinese and the Russians will have built up their military forces to the point where I feel that they're sure that they can overawe their opponents in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific region, to the extent that they are close to their own borders, and at the same time where both the Russians and the Chinese feel that their economies are resilient enough and self-sufficient in combination with each other that sanctions and blockades and embargoes and all those sort of things won't have the kind of effect that some people in Washington and Brussels and London think they will. So, both in terms of these negotiations that we're seeing happening between the Russians and the Americans in Europe, and in relation to the events in the Indo-Pacific over Taiwan, we can see that the board is gradually being set. The pieces are being, as I said, moving, and it is 2024, 2025, perhaps a year or so beyond that, that we will see the major strategic crisis really hit home. Now, I know that isn't quite how many people see this. I know that there's some people who expect war in Europe this year, but as I said, I don't personally believe that is in any way on the Russian agenda. I don't think it's on the Chinese agenda for there to be a war against Taiwan this year either. But you can see how things are starting to move in that kind of direction. To be very clear, I don't think the Chinese or the Russians are looking for war over Taiwan or over Ukraine at all. In both cases, they would rather look for diplomatic solutions, provided the United States acknowledged and said it respected their red lines. Over the situation in Europe, there's some sign that some people in Washington are beginning to understand that it might be in the interests of the United States to do that. But to be realistic about it, I think the kind of grand bargain that the Russians are talking about isn't going to happen. In terms of the situation in the Indo-Pacific, these comments of Mr. Ratner to the Senate and these articles which are appearing in the Financial Times, and the way that ancient memorandum of General MacArthur's from 1950s has been dusted out of the archives, well, that tells us that the willingness to understand that the Chinese have red lines, that hasn't dawned in Washington at all. I'm going to finish by saying one very final point, and that is that MacArthur's memorandum of 1950 and Ratner's comments today, to my mind, demonstrate the way in which the United States is continuing to live to a degree that I don't think its policymakers understand, in the mindset of the 1940s and 1950s. I think the idea that the Chinese have some kind of plan to use Taiwan as some kind of unsinkable aircraft carrier is a fantastic one. But that appears to be how the US thinks. It presumes an intention in Beijing of hostility towards the United States, which is now in effect solid and unchanging, and won't change depending on circumstance. Given that that is the mindset, I can't imagine how we can avoid a smash up in the Pacific any more than to be realistic about it. I think we're going to avoid a smash up eventually in Eastern Europe. Anyway, there we are. That's my video for the day. It's interesting to know what is in the mindset of the United States on the Taiwan issue. There'll be much more about this issue, much more about this conflict before very long, and it will be interesting to see how it plays out and whether any sense of reality will ultimately dawn in Washington. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon on this channel and also on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also check out our other channel, the Duran, our other channel, the one Alex himself makes. You'll also find links under this video. Also, please remember to check us out on Locals, where we have a thriving community where we publicize exclusive content and where I do live streams now every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time, 1900 hours London time. And you can also find us on our various other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, ODYSEE, SuperU, and all the rest. You can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can buy yourself one of the new amazing Good Day magic mugs. You can also support us by checking the like button, by pressing the like button on this video, and by checking your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon. And until then, have a very good day.